All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome everybody. Good morning. Thank you all for coming out today. My name is Emmett Zam. I'm going to be the announcer throughout the evening here today at Track 3. Up next, we have John Sellens, Nagios, and another layer of indirection. So give him a big round of applause, John Sellens.
I suspect Emmett was looking for his notes and saying, where the hell does John work? What is going on? I can't find the page. So what should I tell you about me? I won't tell you too much about me. I'm a longtime system administrator. I'm a Unix guy, which will be reflected in what I talk about today and how I address things. I have my own little company where I do little bits and pieces, and I also am a system administrator at FreshBooks in Toronto. Online cloud accounting for service-based businesses. There's the advertising right there. This is my favorite concept, and if some of you were in my talk yesterday, and I said this several times yesterday, but all problems in computer science can be solved by another layer of indirection. And if you're actually doing computer science or writing programs, then you might think of a data structure and you make a linked list, and then you take another pointer to that same linked list or some nonsense like that, or put a wrapper around your object-oriented stuff. And I went to school a long time ago, and we didn't have object-oriented in those days, so I don't know what that really means, but you can interpret that however you want. And one thing I like about this idea is that you can apply it in many, many different ways. And for example, I have kids, and I want to get the kids to do something. And I ask one kid, will you do this for me? And they say, no, screw off. So I ask the other kid, will you ask that other kid to do things for me? And then they don't yell at me. They'll yell at the second kid. So it doesn't usually work, but at least it gets them off my back. Unix philosophy, and I found, in theory, the origin of this idea of the Unix philosophy. And if you have the notes, you probably don't have the notes yet. But there will be notes, and you know what? I'm going to dive into my bag, and if anybody wants to follow along at home, you can by copying the notes off my little USB key. And this is like the, you go to a gas station, you get the key for the bathroom, and this is so you won't take it home with you. So if you don't have even a computer here, and you don't have well, Sherry probably got the notes yesterday anyway. We have piles of those. We have piles of those.
Anyone, if you have a computer and want the notes, raise your hand. I'm going to whip this right back at you then. Hold on a second. I throw like a girl, so my aim's much better than yours.
I was about to say, there's lots of girls that throw a lot better than I do, but you already said that, so there you go. So Unix philosophy. We talk about Unix philosophy as one thing that does one thing well. And if you look at, what's a good example? I was going to use cat as an example. All it does is it takes its input and spits it on the output. But if you look at the arguments to GNU Cat these days, it'll wash your car, it'll do your laundry, it'll do 12 other things. So it's kind of expanded a little bit from its original idea. But there's still lots of examples in Unix and various other places where write a tool that does the right thing. And hopefully I can convince you that that's a good thing today. Now I'm in America, I'm Canadian, and I'm in the United States now, so I tried to make a joke, and I don't think that joke will work. But if you look at Nagios and how it's put together, and I mentioned this yesterday as well, there's the Nagios core team, there's the Nagios plugins team, there's a whole bunch of different people and groups, organizations everywhere doing little bits and pieces of Nagios, and they all tie together. And that's possible because when Nagios was originally written, and here's the diagram I stole yesterday as well, it's separated out into its component parts with well-defined interfaces between the different parts. So there's Nagios core up here, the web interface, the little green box down in the corner, that's external applications where it can throw commands into the command pipe or look at status logs. And the check commands, those are the plugins. Again, a separate piece from the Nagios core itself. So there's all these different discrete components that are working together with well-defined interfaces between them. And the big advantage of this is that it allows us to subvert Nagios and have it do things that maybe wasn't originally intended. We can add things on, we can put things in the middle, in between one place and another. And so it gives us a lot of flexibility in how we solve our own particular problems. And that's, and I'm going to hopefully build on that today with some of the tools I'm going to talk about. Well-defined interfaces. As I mentioned, all the Nagios components, the interface between Nagios Core and the plugins, it's well-defined. Nagios runs a plugin, gives it some arguments on the command line, gives it some information in the environment, and the plugin sends back an exit code, exit status of 0, 1, 2, 3 for OK, warning, critical, unknown, and a line or multiple lines of text that Nagios just passes on to other people that might be interested in those lines of text. But Nagios itself just looks at the exit code and then does things based on that exit code. So if the exit code is not OK, Nagios might try again and again, and then eventually decide that this is broken and send out notifications. But it'll invoke the notification program and carry on from there. So all these interfaces between the CGIs and the Nagios Core, the external command pipe where other programs can cause Nagios Core to do different things, acknowledge downtime, acknowledge a problem, schedule downtime, various other things. They're all well-defined interfaces and they're all well-documented. And that makes our job a little easier. So where is their indirection? And hopefully I've mentioned a couple places already, and I'm going to give you a few more examples of where I think indirection shows up. My favorite plugin is the Negate plugin. And what Negate does, probably most of us know, but I'll repeat it for the folks following along at home. What Negate does is it inverts the result of a plugin check. So for example, if you want to make sure that there's no web server running on a particular machine, you'll run check TCP port 80 or check HTTP, but probably just the check for the port is good, and then put Negate in front of that. So check if port 80 is open, and if it is open, that plugin returns 0, which is OK. Negate will invert that, convert that 0 into a critical 2, and then Nagios will say, notice that something's wrong. So Negate is a wrapper around other plugins. It's another layer of indirection. And as I said, that's handy for making sure that certain services are not running or files don't exist. So there's a whole bunch of plugins that check for a particular state of one kind or another. And sometimes you want to make sure that that state does not exist. Negate is your friend in that case. When I was talking yesterday, I mentioned that I talk about plugins in terms of local plugins and remote plugins. So a local plugin is something that looks at the state on your local machine. Check disk, for example, runs df and then interprets the output of df. Check HTTP typically will connect across the network to an HTTP port 80 on a remote machine, ask that port some questions, and report back to you about the state of that remote machine. Sometimes we want to run a local plugin like check disk on a remote machine. And the way we do that is by another layer of indirection using plugins like check by SSH, check NRPE, or check SNMP. And these plugins allow us to get there from here simply by directly or indirectly wrapping these plugins around an existing plugin. So we've added another layer between a local plugin. We've added another layer on top of that, and that gets us the results that we want. These days, there's a whole pile of different ways that you can get graphs out of Nagios or collect performance data and cause it to do something. As far as I can remember, the first thing that did graphing in Nagios was a little tool called APAN. And I can't even remember what it stands for, what APAN actually means. But what APAN was, it was a wrapper that you could put around other plugins. So you invoke a check like check ping, for example, because I'm pretty sure that was one of the ones that it handled. So instead of just invoking check ping directly, you would put the check APAN in front of check ping. So run check APAN, it runs check ping, gets the results from that plugin, does something with those results, and then passes them back to Nagios Core. And what APAN did was it would look at the performance data that came back from that plugin call and generate RRD files with that data, and then provide a mechanism that you could put a link into the Nagios web interface to get at those graphs. So APAN was simply a wrapper around existing plugins that collected the performance data and then passed the information on and generated graphs. So it did something useful and without having to change all the existing plugins to generate graphs themselves. Another layer of indirection. And now, of course, these days we have all sorts of things that will grab performance data either as a wrapper or as a command invoked by the, in the Nagios config, you can say, you can define a command that gets run every time you get performance data back, and you can get it that way or write it to a file, or there are some graphing things that use event broker modules to get the data as it's passing by through Nagios. But the original APAN, it was just another layer of indirection around existing plugins. How can we implement indirection? What kind of techniques can we use? So what I've done here is on the next few slides, I've written down what I called principles, and I hope this works. I was trying to think, is principle the best word to use? I thought technique, method, and I stuck with principle. So if that word doesn't work for you, then print out the slides and scratch out principle and write in something else if you're so inclined. So when we're trying to do indirection or add additional capability to Nagios, I've set out these, I think there's 5 of them, principles that I think help us along the way. First one, Unix philosophy. The idea that plugins or other tools don't need to do everything all at once. You can take an existing plugin or an existing tool, add capabilities to it by putting a wrapper or taking that output, putting it through a pipe or things like that, and extending its functionality without actually changing that one little tool. So you can put the tools together in different building blocks. Is there an example I can give you that I'm not about to talk about later? Not off the top of my head, but I'll give you an example later. One of my favorite commands is a command called timeout. And years ago, I used to work at the University of Waterloo, and we wrote an equivalent command to that. But these days, you can get it in at least Red Hat, CentOS, and I think it's probably available in Debian and Ubuntu and stuff like that. But what timeout does is you say, you invoke the command with timeout, and you give it an amount of time, and then what to do when the timeout occurs, and then you give it a command to run. And that way, if you have a command that does some data collection or tries to connect to a remote service, and that command doesn't implement any sort of timeouts itself, you simply wrap timeout around it, and you can cause that command to give up after a certain amount of time. And so it's another layer of indirection that adds functionality, but you don't have to change the existing program to do it. You simply tie things together. And that, to my way of thinking, is the Unix philosophy. The principle of custom wraps. You can take existing plugins, for example, and cause them to do interesting things. You might want to say, is at least one of my web servers up? Or if I get this page, can I also get this particular page? So you can do multi-stage checks by putting a shell script wrapper around them and answer slightly different questions than the plugins themselves can answer. So my examples here are, can I get to this machine in at least one way? Is at least one of these interfaces up? I've got a pool of web servers. Is at least 1 or is at least 5 out of 10 of those web servers up? That may be, if you've got a big pile of things that are redundant, you may not want to be woken up in the middle of the night if one of your machines goes down. But if half of them are down, maybe you do want to get woken up. So you can wrap a plugin around other checks or status checks or looking in the log file, take that information or those tools that you already have and combine their output to give you a different kind of answer. 2 other examples here. You can write, there's a tool called expect, which is written in TCL, which is basically for interacting with things that want to be interactive from a script. So for example, the canonical example of how to use expect is to change your password on multiple machines, because password really wants to talk to a TTY and think there's a human there. What expect does is it sets up an environment that looks just like a human's typing at it, and it looks for the prompt from the password command, types in whatever password you want, and the password command is none the wiser. You can use that same technique for talking to interactive services via a plugin or a script that you put together so that you can find out information from that interactive tool that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get. And the other example I have here is web form posting tools. Company I used to work at, we did EDI. It was in the automotive industry, parts industry, and they had to submit EDI forms to the automakers saying, by the way, we've shipped you this. And if you don't actually submit the shipping notices and invoices and things like that, all hell breaks loose and you start losing money real quick. So this was important. And they had some terrible software for doing it. I set up a Nagios check using a form posting tool that would actually go to these various EDI servers they have and try and log in to make sure that, at least the Windows, it ran on Windows, of course. So it would check that, the software was working, the web server was working, and the database behind it was working, and that user ID actually existed and could authenticate. So you can use these other tools, wrap them around existing things, and get the answers that you want. I have a couple more examples of wrappers. I chose this phrase, pervasive wrapper. So in Nagios, in the resource config file, the convention is the variable user1 tells you the directory where the plugins are. So in your command definitions, most commonly, if you're defining a command to check a web server, usually the command definition starts out that the command line is $user1 / check HTTP, and then all the various arguments that you want to pass to it. If you want to wrap something around all your plugins, you can either go and change your command.config file, change all your command definitions, or you can go to your resource config file, change the definition of user1, and you can instantly put a wrapper around every plugin call that you already have. And I have an example later where I think that's a useful thing to do. And of course, you can do it in various different ways. But here's an example of how you can change how everything behaves in a very simple way. Another example of that I wanted to point out here is using custom object variables. And I mentioned this yesterday in terms of you can set limits for different plugins using, for example, a load warn or load crit custom object variable that you define in a host or a template. And you can use those custom object variables get put into the environment. So if you have existing plugins or wrappers around plugins, you can pass additional information to them very easily using those environment variables. So you don't need to pass information to your plugins just on the command line or through command definitions. There's ways in Nagios that let you define information in a host definition over here that will eventually percolate out to every plugin you call related to that host. So you can subvert things that way. And if you put wrappers around things, you can cause different behavior in a very easy fashion. Okay, that's enough for this page. Too many pages. So one of the things that I think is important is making your config files comprehensible. Now, if you're using a web interface like Nagios QL that I believe is included in Nagios XI, or there's various other web interfaces, you're a little abstracted from your basic configuration files. As I said, I'm an old-time Unix guy. The way you configure anything is you fire up VI, not Emacs, mind you. VI is the one true way. And you edit your config files. So you have to have an understanding of what your config files do. You need to organize them in a way that you can figure out what changes you have to make when you need to add a new check or add a new host and things like that. My assertion is that the simpler you make the config files, the easier your job is going to be. And probably there won't be many arguments about that. However, if you're inclined to try and protect your job by making things look really complicated, then don't use this technique, because otherwise, if you want to make it your domain, then make it as complicated as possible. So what I like to do is I like to try and make my Nagios configs as simple as possible for each machine. If I want to add a new web server host or a new database host, I want the little bit that I have to add to Nagios to do that to be as small as possible. So I use things like host groups and templates so that if I want to add another one of these, usually I can do it just by adding another host definition. I don't have to add service definitions. I don't have to change host groups and things like that. So if I've set up my machine names and my configurations properly, I can make my configs simple. And that And using another layer of indirection in various ways sometimes makes that easier. A method for doing that, or a mechanism that helps me implement that, is that sometimes I will set limits outside of Nagios. And we'll see that a little bit later. But the typical way of configuring Nagios is in your Nagios configs, you say, I want to check the var disk on the web host, and the limits for warning and critical are 70% and 80%. And typically, you would put that right into your Nagios configs. So if the disk gets a little fuller and you say, well, I'll make the limit 85% or 75%, you'd have to go change your Nagios config, put it into place, restart Nagios. In a number of cases, I've implemented limits like that outside of Nagios by using a smarter plugin to maintain those. So I still have to go and change those files, but to me, it provides ways where I can do it more automatically and independently of, and on a per host basis, while still keeping my configs comprehensible. That's my assertion. If we have smarter plugins, then I don't have to think, which is generally a good thing. So let me give you a little example of a slightly smarter plugin. We have a little status board. I work at FreshBooks. We have a little status board that's mounted on a pillar, which is an old iMac that nobody wanted to use because it was only 24 inches rather than 27. So it was just sitting on the shelf. And we have a little status display that I built that gives an overview of our Nagios servers, if there's problems or if everything's good, so that when people come up looking for help, they can look at the screen and say, oh, it's all red. Maybe I should not bother the sysadmins at this particular point in time. It works to at least a certain extent. If you haven't read it already, if you're a sysadmin, probably most of us are, read Tom Limoncelli's book about time management for system administration. One of the things that Tom says is that if you have a group of admins, make sure there's an entry into your area where you are and put the on-duty person at the entrance. So that when somebody wanders across the office looking for help, they get to the on-duty person first. And the people that are not on duty that day, they're hidden away behind. So read Tom's book. It's a good thing in a bunch of ways. So there's the status screen that says whether things are good or bad. And it also has a little section at the top to tell you who is on duty today. And we have a little command called on duty. So if you sign on to our major server and you type on duty, it'll assume that you're on duty. You're taking responsibility for what's going on today. And I have it set up so that at 6 o'clock at the end of the day, at the end of our support hours, we set it so that no one's on duty, just because, well, it looks clean that way. But what I found was that, sysadmins would come into work and we'd just sit down and start working, and not every day would someone claim responsibility for being on duty. So I put in a Nagios check that says, has someone claimed on duty? Now, I could have used a Nagios time period and said, only do this check between these certain hours. But what I did was, in the little plugin itself, I put in a check that says, if it's after 6 p.m., it's okay. Just report, it's after 6 p.m. I don't care if anyone's on duty or not. So I took the smarts about essentially our business process or our business rules, nobody needs to be on duty after 6 p.m. or before 9 a.m., and implemented that in the plugin. So I made the plugin a little smarter. I don't have to worry about configuring time periods and thinking, well, what if no one's on duty at 5:59, and so it's reporting as critical, and I used a time period, so don't check it after 6 p.m., then it would show as critical until the time period finished at 9 a.m. the next morning, when it would still show as critical, but legitimately critical. So I taught the plugin to be a little smarter so that it would report good in the off hours rather than not reporting at all. So that's one example of where I made a smarter plugin. In one I'll mention a little later, checking storage, and I mentioned this yesterday as well, I made a plugin that just goes to a machine and says, what storage do you have, and is it full? And so in Nagios, my Nagios configs, I don't have to say, this machine has these 5 file systems, check with these limits. I just say, check all the storage, tell me if there's a storage problem. And the plugin goes off and makes its own limits and keeps track of what's going on. And if the file systems are okay, then it also checks inodes, make sure you're not running out of inodes on the file system. and things like that. So I can take those plugins, make them a little smarter. It makes my job easier. And one of the things that I do in a number of cases, just the last point here, I'll give you another example. I have a little, very, very simple-minded plugin that checks MySQL, checks the variables in MySQL. So in running MySQL, there's like 200 or 300 or 400 different variables that you get from show variables that tell you about the state of MySQL and various settings, what port it listens on, what time zone it has, the default character set, all that kind of nonsense. My plugin, when I point it at a new MySQL server, it assumes that the existing state is correct. It assumes it's in a normal state, and then it will tell me later if any of those variables change. And that seems to work in a number of cases. So I've made this plugin a little smarter, makes my life easier. And what I've done is, to tie it back to the title of the talk, another layer of indirection to solve this problem. Okay, better get moving on. Derived thresholds, I pretty much just kind of covered this. Let the plugin figure out what is normal. There are mechanisms. There's a thing that, not Cacti, Cricut implemented a number of years ago. Cricut is a graphing tool like MRTG or Cacti. And what Cricut implemented was a thing called Holt-Winters Aberrant Behavior Forecasting. And it's a big, long title, and it's got mathematics in it. But basically, the idea is, you know, disks and CPU usage and network usage changed over time. And the aberrant behavior forecasting figures out, is this outside of normal based on past behavior? And then we'll tell you if it's outside of normal. So you can make a plugin that says, you know what, usually at noon, the network gets a little less busy, or it gets a little busier when everybody's watching videos at noon, and that's normal. So even though it's busier than the average over time, I know that things change normal. You can take a thing that checks your mail queue, and it knows that you send out a big mailing every morning at 9 o'clock to all the staff saying, you know, here's today's announcements. So that your mail queue, your outbound mail queue is going to be a little fuller at that time of day. Your plugins can do those kind of derived thresholds for you to make things easier for you. And the principle here, let the machines figure out what the config should be rather than you having to type things in. So how else can we do this? And this is the point at which I tell you about some of the things that I've done. I was frantically trying to type earlier because some of the software I'm going to talk about is not actually on my website yet. And I thought, well, I better get it there before I talk. And then I had to figure out, okay, I should have a copyright notice in there that says basically you can do whatever the hell you want. But I have an autoconf with the GNU Auto tools of how it puts together, so I had to try and figure out how do I get it to include this file in the tarball, and I gave up. So later on today, more of this will be available. If it doesn't show up when you need it, send me mail, and I'll make sure you can have it available for you if you want. I will make sure I tweet about it. And if I don't, Sherry will make sure I do, because she'll, bam, yeah. So the first thing I want to mention, I wrote a little thing called Check SNMP Exec. I mentioned in my talk yesterday, part of my religion is that SNMP is the way to go to check things over your network. We can talk about that another time if you disagree with me. But I find it very handy. One of the things you can do in the NCSA, the net SNMP, it used to be CMU, it's got a long history. The net SNMP distribution, which is used on virtually all Unix machines these days, Linux and FreeBSD, and those are the only ones that count, of course. The SNMP daemon that comes with that has a configuration file, strangely enough. In the configuration file, you can define exec statements that say, if you ask me this particular SNMP question, if you request this OID, run this command and give the results back. So I have a bunch of plugins that I run through SNMP that way. But on different machines, I might have different plugins available in my SNMP configuration file, and they might be in a different order. So what is exec number 1 on one machine to check storage, on another machine might be a check to check that MySQL is running. So I could keep track of each machine separately, but what I do here with another layer of indirection, the check SNMP exec plugin uses SNMP table to get the table of all the commands that are available to execute on that remote machine by name, looks for a name that matches the one I'm interested in, check DF, figures out what number that is, and then requests the SNMP daemon on the remote machine to execute that particular one. So instead of me having to keep track of which exec is which number on the different machines, I ask the machine, what have you got for me? And I'll choose that one. It's like going to a restaurant, looking at the menu of ice cream flavors, and instead of saying ice cream number 3, you say, I want chocolate ice cream, and it's number 3 on your list over there. Is that a good analogy? I don't know, I'm really hungry.
It's more like going to Amazon.com and looking for a book as opposed to having to remember the ISBN number.
It's more like going to Amazon, looking by title, or looking for your friend's recommendations rather than looking it up by the ISBN. That's a good one. So let the machine do the work of keeping track. And I find that very useful because I can just change my SNMP configuration. We use Puppet for configuration management. It just goes out there and things just work. Check all storage, and I mentioned this earlier. It does an SNMP walk of the HR storage table. I think it does a walk. Yeah, it doesn't do an well, it's either an SNMP walk or an SNMP table of the storage table. Figures out all the volumes that exist on that machine at this particular point in time, and keeps a configuration file of what it had seen last time. You've got a user partition, you've got a var partition, you've got homes, you've got any number of data partitions. Looks at how full that partition is. If it's seen it before, it uses the thresholds out of a file it maintains. If it has not seen that file system before, it says, okay, right now it's 50% full. I'll set a threshold at halfway to 100%. So I'll set the warning threshold at 75% full, and I'll set a critical threshold, I think it does halfway between the warning and full. Writes those down in a file. So and I also have it set up so that it sets minimum amounts. So when you first create a machine and your file system is empty, it won't set the threshold at 50%. It'll set it, assuming that eventually you'll use something there. And so if I add a new file system, or if I have a filer like a NetApp or things like that, the same idea is if I add something new, the plugin notices, writes down information about that, and later on, if it gets too full, we'll complain about it without me having to change my configurations at all. And I mentioned here the check storage plugin that I wrote calls check all storage, and if it's okay, then it will also call check inodes to make sure that the inodes are okay. And that's 2 more levels of indirection on top of things there. I do a similar thing with services on Windows machines. Now, I'm not really Windows inclined, but we all have to deal with some Windows machines in almost every environment. And one of the things that I was having problems with, Windows runs services. Sometimes those services stop. Sometimes Unix or Linux services stop as well. So that's okay. But I had to have a way to figure out what services were running. And what I found is that on Windows machines, services kind of come and go. When you sign onto a machine, there's more services running than when you're not signed onto the machine, which kind of confuses me, but there you go. In the Windows SNMP agent, there's a table for what services are running on the machine. So I do an SNMP table, I get the list of all the Windows services that are running, and then I have a file in my file system where I keep track of what services should be running on this machine, and then I'll complain if those two lists don't add up. And I have a mechanism where I can say, ignore these services all the time, or force these services to always exist. So even when a machine starts up and I first look at it, if a certain service is not running, I can have it complain about that. But again, I just throw a new Windows machine definition into my Nagios configs, say check that the services are what they should be. The check win services says this is the current state, remembers that, assumes that's normal. I said earlier about a pervasive wrapper. MB-Divert is a pervasive wrapper that I've written. The name comes from, I'm making a little thing out of a Raspberry Pi, which is intended to be a remote monitoring box. So you can throw it at a customer site or in a remote data center, and you can talk to it in a bunch of different ways to get information out of that network that you may not have general access to in various ways. And if you're interested in that, talk to me later. But I wrote this thing so that I can take my Nagios configs, send my checks through that remote box, have it check things on my behalf, and send me the answer back. And the use case for this is, for example, if you've got a customer site or a remote site, there's a firewall between it and you want to check all the machines that are in the remote site. So you could open up, you could set up a VPN, or you could set up holes through the firewall to get to every possible machine on every possible port, or you could open one NRPE or SSH connection to get to a remote machine in there, and then do all your checks by check by SSH or check by NRPE to get to that remote machine, and then having it check the other machines over there. Now, normally when we're doing check by SSH or check NRPE, we're assuming that the machine we're connecting to is the one we want to check, but there's no requirement that it actually check itself. So you could essentially SSH into that machine and say, check that machine over there. And it could do an arbitrary number of hops, but if you do more than a few, then if you can keep that straight in your mind, you must be smarter than I am. But there's no requirement that it does it. So what MBDivert allows you to do, it says, given a configuration file, you can say, if I'm going to the data center in Chicago, to a machine named ORD something for Chicago, because you always name it after airport codes, right? If I want to check that machine, then to get there, SSH through this other particular machine, divert through this machine, and have it ask the question that I want. And this is just a wrapper you can put around any plugin, and it has little little hooks or ideas of how it can figure out what machine you actually want to talk to and where it is and things like that. And you can implement MBDivert. You can do it on a per command line. So command definition, just stick MBDivert in front of your normal command line definition, or you can put it in the user1 variable so it applies to everything. And a sample configuration file for it is to say, and what it does is it reads the configuration file in order. So in this case, it says method SSH. So if I'm going to go anywhere from here on in, use SSH to get there, essentially check by SSH. Plugin match. So if the plugin I'm trying to run is check open manage or check SNMP, in this case, those are regular expression matches, then divert through that machine. So if I'm doing check SNMP, then I'm going to send that check through the machine MSP management company com. And then the line prefix, that's where it actually matches a host. So it looks at the host I want to check. I want to check MSP Web 01. In this case, if the host I want to check, if its name starts with MSP, then send the check through the machine MSP management company com by SSH. And then in this case, I reset the plugin match, so now it'll match any plugin. And then, for example, if I'm going to San Francisco, I'll be sure to wear flowers in my hair, but I'll also use NRP to get there. Did anybody get that flowers in your hair, San Francisco? Okay, good. I'm not the oldest. I am the oldest one in the room, but there you go. So if we're going to San Francisco, I'm going to use NRPE to get there, and the divert dash means go directly to the host I want to talk to. So it believes that it can NRPE to any machine in San Francisco, and the prefix SFO just says, if it matches this host name, then apply those rules. And then otherwise, I could just go direct without diverting through NRPE or SSH. And I found over the past couple of years that this has solved a bunch of problems for me. But this is another layer of indirection where I've got this, I was going to say smarts or intelligence. I've got a configuration file outside of Nagios that implements certain rules about how to get there from here. And I found that to be useful. And as I said, I wrote this to work with this little tool that I'm building, but you can use it in any number of other cases. And at FreshBooks, for example, we use it to get from our office into our remote data centers in a number of cases. So this is a thing that I wrote earlier this year, which it turned out to be, I really like this thing, and hopefully you might find it useful as well. So if you want to send notifications from Nagios, typically what we do is we define a notification command that says, typically printf of a whole bunch of Nagios variables and pipe it into mail. And so you end up with this notification command line inside your Nagios configs. That's this big, long, convoluted thing with a million different dollar signs and quotes around different things in a pipe and this, that, and the other thing. And I thought that was kind of convoluted. And then I thought, well, what if you want to have different notification messages based on the service that you're notifying about, or the host you're notifying, or the data center, or the contact group? And I thought, if you tried to do that just inside Nagios, you'd drive yourself insane, because you'd have to have a whole pile of different notification commands, and you have to figure out how to get that one invoked in the right case. I thought there's got to be a better way to do it. And we had a bunch of notification messages that were kind of big and ugly, and I thought, well, I have to tidy those up anyway, so let's see what we can do. So I wrote this thing that I called Genoa, generic notification, and then I didn't know what to say for A. So I said author, arranger. He just said 10 minutes. And so author, arranger, artist. So what I came up with the idea of, I've got a bunch of template files, and I use those Nagios environment variables. Remember I said earlier, Nagios puts all its variables in the environment, and your plugin can use them. It also applies to notification commands. So it uses all those variables to figure out which template file to use, and then substitutes those variables into the template file and sends off your message for you. And it can choose the template based on all sorts of things. It chooses them based on host name, the type of problem. Is it a service problem or a host problem? The notification type, is it an acknowledgement, a problem okay, problem or a recovery or anything like that, or based on a couple of custom object variables that you can put in there. And so my notification commands become Genoa-S, which means format up this notification, send it by mail. Or the other one here, if I want to send a page, Genoa-P, format it for pagers, which use a different directory of templates, and send it -T, send it to tell it to, which is the next command I'm going to talk about, the next little tool. So here's a sample template. I just have this in a file in the file system, and this is in the templates directory, and this is maybe the default one for service problems. And the files are named for the type of notification it is. And if you grab the tarball, it has some sample configs in there. And hopefully it should be fairly obvious how that all figures itself out. So here's these typical Nagios variables. And I have a set or an awk command. I think it's an awk command that goes through and replaces those with the values from the environment. So you can, here's an easy way to format the messages just the way you want them, put the information in. And you can customize this based on a per host basis. Now what this is, these templates are just, at least in the current version, they're just variable substitution. But there's nothing preventing anyone from taking the existing Genoa shell script and saying, putting ifs or put logic in there, or instead of just doing a simple variable substitution, put it through a macro language like M4, for example, so you can do arbitrary if-then-else's if you're so inclined. What we found is that this gives us some pretty good flexibility and good results. So I really like the way this turned out. So hopefully you might find it useful as well, or at least the idea useful. And here's some sample templates for pagers. So pager messages, you want them to be shorter. So we have XX means this is a problem, and ACK means acknowledge. Well, duh. And so these are just little one-line things that get piped off to our pager sending mechanisms. So that's worked out. I was really pleased when I figured that out. It was just a simple little thing. It's another layer of indirection, but it solved the problem and made things a lot more comprehensible and flexible for us. So tell it to. One of the problems we have is that we have a number of ways to get to our phones. So I have a phone here that can get messages. Duh. I can email to my phone and get an SMS that way, but my provider's email gateway is a pile of crap and isn't always necessarily reachable. I can use an SMS provider to go to somebody's website and say, here's an SMS message to send to this particular phone, and they'll charge me 25 cents a shot. The phone providers we have TAP phone numbers, the old pager protocol, where you get your 1200 baud modem, you dial up their phone number, and you say, send a message to this pager number, which happens to be a phone. And those calls are free. And I don't understand. I figure our phone providers have just forgotten that those phones are there, because otherwise they could be charging for it. So we just keep it on the quiet. But we only have a modem in our office. We do not have modems in our data centers, and we don't have GSM modems because, well, we don't. So we have a number of ways to get to our pagers, and some of them might work. So if I want to send through a modem, I have to get back to the office. But if I can't get back to the office, I want to send it in a different way. And in Nagios, there's not an easy way to say, if you want to page this guy, try this. If that doesn't work, then try this. And if that doesn't work, then try this. And so what tell it to does is it implements that logic for you in hopefully a relatively simple way. And you could also use it for something else. So if you've got a shell script that wants to send a page, you can just pipe it into Tele2, and it'll do it. So you've got this one file that has all your information about how to get to people. And this has worked out well. And I tied it into Genoa. So if you say Genoa-T, that just tells Genoa to pipe its output into Tele2. And what Tele2 it has a config file that looks like this. So here it says Bob and Sally. And those are the 4 ways you can get to Bob and the 4 ways you can get to Sally. And they're run in order. They're just shell commands. They're run in order until one of them succeeds. So most times the first one will work. So in this case, page user, that's a little cover script for Hylafax that connects back to the modem in our office and tries to send out a page that way. If you can't connect to the office, then it uses the script called SMS Gateway, which connects to smsgateway.ca, which is an SMS provider. So here's just a little simple mechanism where I can implement logic of how to find somebody. And it makes my Nagios config simpler again, another layer of indirection. I'm doing okay on time. So those are the 5 principles that I outlined of how to make your life easier. And I hope I gave some examples that did that. And I think that's my last slide. Hallelujah. And it is 9:46, 4 minutes to spare. So I've told you all those things, and I've tried to give examples of how you can make your life easier with this another layer of indirection. And sometimes I've stretched that analogy a little bit, but hopefully you'll cut me some slack that way. And at this point, any questions? The coffee is in the hall. Yes? There will, I have to put this software on my website. It's going to be there. My website is referenced in the notes, but and the notes are on this USB key, but that won't help you with an iPad. Sorry. Syonex.com/software. SYONEX.com/software will get you to where the stuff will be, hopefully later today. And if you can't find that, then send me mail. Okay, thank you very much for coming. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, John.